Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. I apologise for my absence last week, but I was in Maputo, and I'm just so pleased with the camera on my Samsung S5 phone. I took this photograph of the snow peaks of Kilimanjaro, Pemba, Mozambique, from the sky as we were coming into land. This I liked a lot, which was of the early evening, the sunset in Maputo, I really am grateful for that. And it took me to Roland Barthes, who says, "A photograph is always invisible. It is not it that we see. And then the photographic image is a message without a code." I wrote a piece after my visit to Maputo, if I may read it to you. Mozambique, Africa rising. Mozambique could be the next Qatar, I said. I was kindly invited by the IMF and the government of Mozambique to attend the second Africa Rising conference in Maputo last week. Maputo sits at the end of the ancient Indian Ocean maritime route. The precocity of the Indian Ocean as a zone of long-range navigation and cultural exchange is one of the glaring facts of history. Made possible by the reversible escalator of the monsoon. The monsoon would take you from India and that part of the world all the way down to Maputo, which was at the end of this long-range navigation exchange, and then it would bring you back. And I said today it is self-evident that Mozambique sits on gas reserves which will, if the execution is optimal, and optimal execution around our natural resources is a sine qua non of the Africa Rising narrative, in my opinion, transform Mozambique into the next Qatar. Just like our president, who said the following of Madame Lagarde, the MD of the IMF, when he hosted her at State House in Mombasa last year: "Madame MD, your style has won you accolades amongst your peers in IMF member states, calm, cool, persistent, inclusive and considerate." I too am an admirer of the MD. I appreciate her emphasis on what I characterize as girl power, because I know that countries that leverage the female component have a head start and a competitive advantage. I appreciate the nature and the tone of the IMF's engagement in Africa, which has been recalibrated for the 21st century, and it is clear to me that the IMF has a role to play, not least because policymakers will make mistakes. Look at Ghana, where the president claims he is looking for a homegrown solution to a situation of his making, and frankly there isn't one. I follow markets ahead of words, and the Ghana cedi, which has collapsed more than 20% this year, is the loudest signifier of all. Some might feel, there was a bit of a debate and a frisson on the last session, that Madame Lagarde's IMF soft pedals on key issues, but my impression is that underneath Lagarde's velvet glove there lies an iron fist. In my humble opinion, the IMF is more than a bank of last resort, a bailout bank as it were. They are inserting themselves into the policy-making architecture, and it is that normative influence that I hope will keep the Africa Rising narrative on track. Interestingly, you will note a linguistic inflection point in Zimbabwe of late. This is entirely due to the IMF, and I wish to give a hat tip to another friend, Domenico Fanizza. It's early days, but there is a trend change. The last decade has been one where Africa has risen its narrow because it's only a decade old, and as such only a recent phenomenon in the scheme of things. And it has been a rising tide that floated all boats. Stock markets rallied from east to west, from north to south. It was a momentum thing. You can imagine the cry of surfs up resonating all over the world, and fund managers from New York to London, from Tokyo to the GCC, getting their swimming trunks and their surfboards. Well, what is clear in 2014 is Africa Rising is no longer a homogeneous thing. You have to pick your waves now, Otherwise, like those who missed the reversible escalator of the monsoon, you might find yourself beached with no way back. The momentum is no longer uniform, and the markets are punishing missteps, and how. It is a little counterintuitive, but this is why I want the government to issue the Eurobond as quickly as possible, the reason being that for the first time, the markets will respond to policy making on a real-time basis. This will bring some of the outlier utterances firmly under control. The cause and effect will be there for all to see, because as long as it is not, the crazies still have a voice, and I, for one, am fatigued by having to engage with the crazies. I'll put up a link for Christine Lagarde's Mindspeak session in January this year, where she was such a tremendous guest. My home thoughts, and I ordered all this backlog of books written by Don DeLillo and Thomas Pynchon, and I've been back to Don DeLillo's Mao 2, which was published in 1991, and it was his 10th novel. The title is derived from a series of Andy Warhol silk screen prints depicting Mao Zedong. One of the very famous quotes in this book is, "The future belongs to crowds." And on that note, I'll put up a photograph of a sea of student protesters gathering in Tiananmen Square on the 4th of May 1989. And I shall put up a photograph of Andy Warhol's Chairman Mao. And from the book, there are plenty of very memorable phrases and paragraphs, but I like these two. I used to announce ball games to myself. Indeed, I did as well, except mine was cricket. I was the players, the announcers, the crowd, the listening audience, and the radio. There hasn't been a moment since those days when I've felt nearly so good. We all know the thing we secretly fear is not a secret at all, but the open and eternal thing that predicts its own recurrence. Political Reflections, the IISS Shangri-la dialogue, caused a bit of a furore, and the speech delivered by the Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel in particular, who said that the rebalance is not a goal, not a promise or a vision, it's a reality. A central premise of American strategy in the Asia-Pacific is our recognition that in the 21st century, no region holds more potential for growth, development, and prosperity than this one. And this is where the trouble started. But in recent months, China has undertaken destabilizing unilateral actions asserting its claims in the South China Sea. It has restricted access to Scarborough Reef, put pressure on the long-standing Philippine presence at the Second Thomas Shoal, begun land reclamation activities at multiple locations, and moved an oil rig into disputed waters near the Paracel Islands. My conclusions are that Chuck Hagel ratcheted the linguistics several notches higher. Then in response, on China Central Television, Wang said Hagel had openly pointed his finger at China in a public setting. Secretary Hagel's speech is full of American hegemony. Secondly, it's full of threats and intimidation. Thirdly, it's full of instigation and incitement aimed at provoking restless elements in the Asian-Pacific region to stir up trouble. I feel they're echoing each other and sang a duet, Wang said of Hagel and Abe. We can see from the Shangri-La dialogue this year it's Japan and the US who stirred up conflict. And then referencing Mr. Abe, Wang said, when Mr. Abe spoke just now, there was veiled criticism targeted at China. These accusations are wrong and go against the standards of international relations. And my conclusions are that the pivot is bearing its fangs again, as it did in early December when I wrote about it, and I'll put the link up to that article, The Pivot to Asia Bears Its Fangs. There's been a big meeting in Doha of the airlines, but the mystery remains of how MH370 flew into oblivion. And then, interestingly, of course, Assad is facing election today when Reuters starts with once on the edge of defeat. Assad runs again for president. It was not long ago that Assad's enemies thought he was finished. In the summer of 2012, the rebels were just not at the gates of Damascus, but inside the capital, preying on Assad's harried forces. Buoyed by a sequence of victories over the past year, won in large part through Iran and Hezbollah, its Lebanese paramilitary proxy, Assad will be elected president this week for a third 7-year term. There is a note of triumphalism when he speaks, a sense that the tide of the crisis that began as a popular revolt against his rule has turned in his favor. Loss of 160,000 lives, displacement of 10 million Syrians. He said, the battle may be long, but we're not afraid. So indeed, and I think, the price that ordinary Syrians have paid is quite just appalling. But he has proven very sticky, and frankly, he would win a free and fair election. All ends up. I'll put up a photograph of him. Interesting article in Asia Times of death by 1,000 cuts, referencing back President Obama's speech at West Point last week. President Obama's unwillingness to employ military action against Syria or in the Ukraine is, I think, a reflection of his bedrock principle, his aversion to committing US military power unless it is absolutely necessary, a conviction that he has maintained at some cost against determined pushback by hawks within his administration, in Washington and internationally. No more Vietnams or Iraqs. He says, unfortunately, the flip side of the Obama doctrine is that the United States remains committed to a forward counter-terrorism posture, and US leadership, i.e. the ability to shape events overseas even without using military power. Even when holding back on military power, there are plenty of ways for the United States to cripple a designated adversary. There's economic sanctions, financial warfare through the international banking, economic and trade system. There's subversion through the internet, through support of dissident parties and insurrectionists. There's proxy wars. There's the Joint Special Operations Command, and of course there are drones. And in fact, President Obama has been a very aggressive user of those new tools. And I think at times, the American foreign policy commentariat prefer the sort of shock and awe, the spectacle, as opposed to President Obama's sort of under the radar type response, which is, in my view, more aggressive and more red in tooth and claw. Xi Jinping called for copper walls and iron barriers, as well as nets spread from the earth to the sky in the Xinjiang region to stop terrorism. I wrote about this in December 2013 when I said Xinjiang might well morph into China's Afghanistan. And I see the pivot to Asia as the encirclement of China, the shrinking of its operating theatre, then lighting the tinderbox that is the periphery. And I said then Xinjiang might well morph into China's Afghanistan. Israel, according to the Sunday Times, is to deploy nuclear-armed submarines off the Iranian coast. The 1,500-kilometer range of the submarine's cruise missiles can reach any target in Iran. International markets, the euro is holding its nose above 136 at 136.04. But the dollar got as high as 135.86 on May the 29th, which was the strongest level since Feb 13. Dollar index pushed through the top of the range at 80.60 last. Japanese yen 102.38. Swissy 0.8984. The pound 167.46. Come off a little bit, but it's appreciated 9.4% in the past year and is the best performer among 10 developed nation currencies tracked by Bloomberg. Aussie 0.9250 fell 0.7% yesterday, but looking at the currencies, it seems the higher beta currencies took a bit of a drawdown. Indian rupee 59.145, South Korean won 10.2385. The real, that softened on a weak GDP number last week, 227.66. Egyptian pound stable again at 714.03. and the rand has moved off to 1066.15. 10-year Treasury yields were little change at 2.52%, having risen 5 basis points in the last session. But they had a 17 basis point rally in May. Dollar index, as I said, top of the range. I'll put up a 3-month chart. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index is the highest since April 7. I think it's really more a story of euro weakness than dollar strength. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the euro dollar, and you can see it's come off dramatically. And the expectations are that European policymakers will cut the central bank's deposit rate to negative 0.1% from zero, though some are expecting negative 0.15%. Euro area inflation probably slowed to 0.6% in May from 0.7% in April. And as I said, when I was at that conference in Milan, it's very clear that the consensus is there now. And I think, the ECB take a little bit longer than others to build consensus, but they've got it now. Dollar yen, 102.38. Dow and S&P ended at records. I'll put up a 1-year chart comparing the Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ. The Dow ended at a second consecutive record high, while the S&P 500 closed at a third consecutive record. Volume was slighter than normal. I wrote about this again on the 12th of August 2013 when I said the recovery in the West is not a mirage, it is real. Commodity markets, gold 1243.33, I think it's going lower still. Slid to 1241.11 yesterday, the lowest since February the 3rd. Fell, of course, 28% last year, but it's up marginally this year. Crude oil 102.52 came off the very high nosebleed territory it was at. And then the interesting story about the most luxurious first-class cabins that I found on Bloomberg. That link is under rich wrap-ups. Ecuador is sending gold bricks to Goldman Sachs in liquidity hunt, which will send 466,000 ounces of gold to Goldman Sachs, worth about $580 million at current prices. The Hindu Triad from the Indian Civilization series 2008 to 2011 by M.F. Hussain. I like this painting, and I'll post that. Malawi's president seeks new friends in China and Russia. Malawi is traditionally dependent on Western aid donors, will look for new friends in countries such as China and Russia, newly elected President Peter Mutharika said. Ceremony at a stadium in Blantyre was boycotted by outgoing President Joyce Banda, who was soundly beaten by Mutharika in disputed elections held on May 22nd. Mutharika said, "We will continue with traditional relationships, but we are now looking for new friends in emerging economies such as Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and Russia." Mutharika said he regretted Banda's absence, saying she had declined to come here and hand over power to me. "I was looking forward to shaking her hand and burying the past. I have an olive branch in my hands," he said. A spokesman for Banda said she was not officially invited, and her official presidential convoy was withdrawn early hours of Saturday, as soon as it was announced that Peter Mutharika had won the presidency. It would have been difficult for the outgoing president to travel to Blantyre. Mutharika said, "It's been a long journey. We didn't know when we would reach this far and be here today." He spoke of no revenging or vengeance. I'll put up a photograph of him waving at the Kamuzu Stadium. Interesting article in Al Jazeera about how all African countries except Eritrea receive some form of US military assistance, according to data from the US State Department. Most of this assistance is channeled through the department's International Military Education and Training Program, which facilitates professional relationships with African militaries. The Obama administration is looking to invest in new, effective, and efficient small footprint locations and develop innovative approaches to using host nation facilities or allied joint basing as part of its focus on security in Africa. A handful of African nations, including Ethiopia, South Sudan, Niger, Uganda, Kenya, Mauritania, Mali, the Seychelles, and Burkina Faso, already host US drone sites. My conclusions are that the US Africa Command is a compelling and decisive hard power lever that spans the continent, which can be deployed to tilt the pitch. From the IMF Africa Rising Conference, which I attended, concluding statements: policies need to be designed in such a way to ensure that a surge in growth can also spur structural transformation. This is the joint declaration. Sub-Saharan Africa will need to redouble efforts to harness the opportunities offered by its abundant natural resources and ensure that their fruits are equitably shared, the governments agreed. Lagarde said policymakers had no illusions about the scale of problems affecting Africa. There has clearly been a solid trend of growth over the last few years, and obviously, surprisingly so, during the financial crisis. There are also big issues to be addressed and potential risks on the horizon. But she also insisted the picture was better today than in previous decades, saying you have to flash back. What was it like 10 years ago? And I took a photograph of one of the screens, Africa Rising screens at the conference, and I tweeted that day, Africa rising, but no longer in the rising tide floats all boats way it was in 2012 and 2013. There's been a solid phase of growth, Lagarde told reporters at Africa Rising, but she's cautioning that there are big issues to be addressed, hence the new concept, Africa Watching. Mozambique's Renamo said ceasefire is over as 20 military killed. Renamo said the country's Muxungi region was a conflict zone after it ambushed soldiers trying to kill its leader, Afonso Dhlakama. At least 20 military died on May 31st and June 1 following provocative attacks by government forces. We were aware that the government was planning a large attack in the Gorongosa Hills to chase and kill our leader. We prepared our men and ambushed them. So it still remains fluid. A lot of gossip that the government in Mozambique was trying to put together a package in order to buy off Dhlakama and asking the oil companies for pretty big contributions, which I don't think they were entirely happy about. China swaps gusto for rigor in Africa as it learns from mistakes. China's gung-ho foray into Africa is waning. As trade with the continent surpasses an annual $160 billion, its companies are avoiding risk by taking smaller stakes in projects close to making money. There was a lot of enthusiasm and momentum, and then saying Libya actually gave China its biggest wake-up call when the 2011 civil war forced Chinese construction companies to abandon billions of dollars worth of equipment and business, and 30,000 Chinese workers were evacuated. And I wrote about that at the time. I put up a poster in Chinese hangs at an abandoned construction site in Benghazi. And I think US Africa Command is an instrument that is in part designed to staunch the Chinese advance in Africa. Angola has announced a ruling MPLA Special Congress for December. But as we said before, it will be a Congress of analysis and reflection, not to renew the mandates of executive bodies of the President. Average FDI for Zimbabwe 2002 to 2012, $88 million compared to $800 million for Zambia, $586 million for Mozambique, and $486 for Botswana. South African all shares plus 7.7003% in 2014. It's below that key 50,000 level. Dollar versus rand has slipped a little bit. I don't see it going to 11. I see it turning stronger at 1066.15, and probably an interesting point to get in here again. Egyptian pound stable now at 714.03. The Egyptian stock market up 18.169% in 2014. Outstandingly interesting article in the Telegraph of how Sisi plotted to save army rule even while Hosni Mubarak was in power. Sisi drew up a blueprint for the army to seize power in case of a revolution against ex-President Hosni Mubarak as long ago as 2010, senior advisors have revealed. When the revolution of January 25th exploded, the army already had plans to deploy, said Hassan Nafa, a prominent political scientist who was briefed personally on his report by the then General Sisi. Nigerian all shares up 0.4181% in 2014, and when you lay that against the news flow we've seen, it's had a very strong, more than 10% rally in the last 6 weeks. Ghana Stock Exchange plus 8.3512%, but all your returns have been killed by a very weak SEDI. Apparently, the Zebra Odyssey encompasses a round-trip journey of 500 kilometers, starting in the floodplains near the Namibia-Botswana border, follows a route across the Chobe River, and ends at the seasonally full water holes and nutritional grass in Natsai Pan National Park in Botswana. Zebras spend about 10 weeks there before heading back. Apparently, this is the longest migration anywhere in Africa. I'll put up a photograph I took of a zebra in the Amboseli last year. Bankers assured of Zim reforms. There's been a trend change in the language coming out of Zimbabwe. Executives with foreign-owned banks are expecting reforms to Zimbabwe's indigenization policy to come into effect during the third quarter. We now have a clear understanding of indigenization in the banking sector, said the MD of Barclays Zimbabwe. I wouldn't say it's still an issue that concerns us. So you can see there's a big change. Interesting article saying that in April, the Combined Task Force CTF 150 of the Naval Coalition based in Bahrain pulled a whopping 1,032 kilograms of heroin, a record near Kenya and Tanzania. Coming to Kenya, bombings threaten Kenya's growth goals, open new strains with wary West is the article in Yahoo. Recent bombings in Kenya have dented President Kenyatta's plans to boost tourism and undermined his pledge to restore security after last year's Westgate attack. Travel warnings issued by the US, Britain, France, and Australia have sent their citizens packing, emptying Kenya's palm-fringed beaches and forcing hotels to lay off staff. On taking office last year, Kenyatta vowed to lift tourism numbers to 5 million annually within 5 years, 3 times last year's level, and get economic growth into double figures in his bid to raise incomes and lift millions out of poverty. Travel alerts also point to a fresh point of friction between the West and Kenyatta. The West risks opening a new divide with Kenyatta as they did with the ICC, but the tension so far appears more benign, said Macharia Munene. Travel advisories have put the coastal city of Mombasa essentially off limits. I was sent home because there weren't enough visitors at the hotel, said 27-year-old Tumaini Sidi, a maid at the luxury Shyrock Beach and Spa Hotel in Mombasa. And I was thinking to myself, you've already got so much. It's a tinderbox down there, you're going to put all these other people onto the street. Tourism is Kenya's second biggest source of foreign exchange after agriculture, earning 1.02 billion last year, or about 12% of the nation's GDP. Industry is a major employer, providing about 500,000 jobs directly and generating work for a host of support industries, from food suppliers right down to vendors selling trinkets on the street. Kenyatta's double-digit target for economic growth was already overly optimistic, but the continued decline in the tourism sector will further complicate efforts to boost growth. Europeans account for nearly half of Kenya's tourists. Become wary the government is eyeing more visitors from China, but that's a long-term plan. There were only 38,000 Chinese visitors last year. Impact of the security situation on domestic confidence, and this is a good point Razia is making, is far more important as a driver for growth. This is where Kenya faces its greatest vulnerability, and there's been a trend change in that as well. Al-Shabaab, of course, has not claimed responsibility for the May attacks in Nairobi and Mombasa, which has prompted some to question whether the government is right to blame it. Officials insist it is Al-Shabaab or their sympathizers. Al-Shabaab could not be reached for comment. It is rented terrorists, says Mutahi Gunyi, but a lot of people think that it's a sort of black ops operation. I wrote about this on the 19th of May when I said the dashboard is blinking amber. Kenya pays price over graft scandal to ease bond sale. That's the FT, where Githonga made some interesting comments. John Githonga, the corruption-busting official who first exposed the Anglo leasing scandal and later fled the country, says Kenya's reputation was irreparably damaged long ago. We're going to have to pay off a bunch of ghosts companies so we can borrow more money that we might end up giving to another bunch of ghosts, he said in an interview. There is no precedent for such a borrowing as the sovereign bond being spent on the right stuff. Kenyan history, he adds. I wrote that piece about how Kenya needs a $2 billion Eurobond on May 26th. That link's on the website. Shilling is firmed up a little bit to 87.656. Closed at 2.5-year lows on May 20th. Printed a trade above 88 severally in recent times. But as I said then, this time of the year is a period of secular weakness for the shilling, as full-year dividends are upstream to parent companies. On balance, I said then, and subject to security issues staying on the trend line, considerably elevated in 2014, then the shilling should improve from here. Nairobi all shares up 9.915% in 2014. The NSE 20 is down 0.92166% in 2014. There's a link for any and every share that's listed at the NSE. Sasini Tea and Coffee reported a sharp slide in 6-month results. Revenues were down 6.6%. Profit before tax down 85.77%. Profit after tax down 85.722%. And earnings per share down 89%. There was no dividend. The company said the decrease in profits is largely as a result of significantly lower prices of tea and lower production of coffee in the period under review. Rio Vipingo, which is currently frozen at the NSE, reported 6 months profit before tax down 31.803%. Revenue was higher, 5.337%. Profit before tax down 31.803%. Earnings per share down 35.22%. No interim dividend. Revenues were higher, which speaks to the low beta nature of sisal prices. In my view, Rio is the subject of a bidding war. I've got a link to an article I wrote in December, Bidding Wars, the Robinos versus Centi. Interesting article in Bloomberg on $145,000 safari. Helicopters unlock African wilderness. The sun has just risen above the snow-covered summit of Mount Kenya when Ben Simpson lifts off from the backyard of his tin-roofed cottage on Kenya's Laikipia Plateau. A lean, sun-weathered 39, Simpson is among the most experienced and sought-after bush pilots on the African continent. And it's a very, very interesting article. He says we live on coffee and cigarettes, and describing the sort of journeys that he undertakes. About 200 employees of Tata Chemicals Magadi will lose their jobs as the company plans to close down its premium ash Magadi plant operations. And then the Business Daily's got a report of how Kenyan firms are planning cash calls totaling 50 billion shillings. And I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on the equity market, particularly if a lot of that new money from the Eurobond is gobbled up, as people are predicting, by a $600 million redemption for the syndicated loan and an $800 million down payment for the railway, which is what I'm being told. Once again, thank you for stopping by. I apologize for my absence. Glad to be back. I'm wishing you a super week.